My name is Melissa Marsh. I am an HR consultant and own HRinDemand. I've been working with small businesses in our community for 10 years now and helping small businesses that don't have HR departments get a handle on HR and get through some of the hard stuff. And I can say without a shadow of a doubt that this year was by far the most challenging of all the years I've been doing this in the efforts that we've taken at HRinDemand to help out small businesses. So I don't think I have to go into a lot of detail about that. I think everybody is well aware how challenging this the year 2020 was for business. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today is the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. This was certainly one of those things that 2020 threw at us for anyone that has employees and a head count of less than 500 people. It was quite an interesting piece of legislation. It got passed very quickly, so much so that it was hard for the DOL to put regulations in place to be able to enforce it. And that was all done through, majority of it through a Q&A on their website, where we could look on there and get our questions answered about something that was brand new, had no precedent, and we had no idea what we were supposed to be doing as employers. It has since expired. I'm going to talk about that a little more because you're probably wondering, why am I talking about something that's expired? But there is more to say about it. So we'll also talk a little bit about how you handle the requests if somebody does ask for time off under this set of provisions, and then how you go about getting that tax credit. Hopefully, many of you are already familiar with this, but we'll talk about it just briefly, and if you've got questions, please let me know. So the law that was passed, the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, that included these mandated paid leave for any employer that had 500 or less employees, was set to expire December 31st. And in fact, it did. But what happened is that while it's no longer required, employers can continue to receive that tax reimbursement through the IRS. So no one has to do it, but you can do it. And what's great about it is if you do have a team member who is sick and has COVID, or has to stay home because someone in their household has it, or isn't able to come to work because their child's school is closed, or the variety of reasons that we can use this paid leave, we can still do it. And so ultimately it means sick employees stay home, they still get paid, and it helps prevent the spread of COVID. It's interesting to note that today was an expiration date for, I'm going to go back one, for the Department of Health and Human Services declaring that it's a public health emergency for COVID-19. And that was renewed at the beginning of January. So as of tomorrow, we are still considered to be in a public health emergency, which just is a strong indicator that the federal government acknowledges that we'll remain in a pandemic for the foreseeable future and well into 2021. So extension is likely, both for the public health emergency, but we may also see an extension of this being able to get these tax reimbursements. That is set to expire March 31st, so we'll see what happens there. I think it's interesting to share with you all that there was a recent study that shows the availability of the FFCRA leave actually reduced the spread of COVID. So the Health Affairs Journal published a study in October of this past year that concluded states who gained access to paid leave through Family First Coronavirus Response Act saw statistically significant 400 plus fewer confirmed COVID-19 cases per day. So this being able to have these leaves and employers having access to get reimbursed for it was definitely a contributor to reducing the spread of COVID, which is pretty cool. So if you're an employer and you have less than 500 employees, you no longer have to provide this paid leave, but you still can. So it's a nice tool to have if you want to encourage people to stay home who are concerned about having to take unpaid time off. I will say, though, that if someone has already used the limits of the paid leave, that does not reset. So they are no longer eligible for the paid sick leave if they've used 80 hours or they're in a full-time position. And also something that's tricky is if they've used that with a different employer, they're not supposed to use it with another employer. So now as an employer, you have this situation where you should probably be asking your newer employees if they ever request it. Well, did you by chance use this at your previous job? So lots of things that employers have to pay attention to, and that Department of Labor website with the Q&A is a very helpful tool when it comes to making sure you're doing all the things you're supposed to do. So speaking of that, how do you handle these requests for time off? I'll go through this quickly because hopefully at this point, anyone who needs to know this does know it. I think having a form that helps you process these leave requests consistently is really important. For me, I helped many clients with this and actually handled the process of making sure that the requests were used with a form. And it was very nice to have something that helped ensure that each and every time it was handled the same way with an employee, no matter how far apart requests for leaves were. So it also helped to make sure that the employer is compliant with the IRS documentation that they're receiving for tax credit, and talk a little bit more about that in a second here. It's important to remember that this time off is the employee's choice. And then if someone is asking for an intermittent schedule, and this generally applies with the expanded FMLA, which only comes into play if it's a parent whose son or daughter has a school that has closed related to COVID-19 and they have no childcare, or a daycare has closed because of it and they have no alternate childcare. They can request an intermittent schedule. That is something that has to be agreed on by both the employee and the employer. So that the employer can't just say, okay, I can't give you the intermittent schedule, and the employee can't just say, okay, I need this and this is the time that I need it. It is to be collaborated on and decided on together. So how do you get those tax credits? Well, it's through the federal payroll tax. You really should get guidance from a CPA or your payroll service provider. I'm certainly not a CPA, nor do I have any desire to even play one on TV. So make sure that you are getting guidance from your experts in these areas. And it is set up so that if your quarterly payroll tax does not cover the cost of whatever leave you've paid out, that you can fill an additional tax form and get further reimbursement for that amount that was paid to your employees in that quarter. So what the IRS is saying is mandatory is that you maintain all your documentation related to getting this reimbursement for 4 years. So for example, if someone says, I tested positive for COVID, I need to stay home, the employer then at some point should get some sort of documentation that shows that, a copy of the positive test results, something. And having looking at the IRS website is also helpful. They've done a frequently asked question page that tells you exactly what your requirements are and what documentation you're supposed to keep. So look to that for guidance there. I talked to a client not too long ago, well, really a prospective client, and they had been giving people leave whenever they needed it because they didn't want, people feeling like they had to come to work sick, but they weren't maintaining the documentation. And so we had a conversation about this situation where the person was sick, but what do you do, and how do you deal with that now? If you're just learning this, what do you do? It may be worthwhile to go back and ask people if you can have a copy of a positive test, or even something from a doctor's office, an appointment, anything that would help you show to the IRS that this in fact was a legitimate reason for the leave. Again, go to their website. Their frequently asked questions outline very specifically what you're supposed to keep as documentation. So before I move on to our next topic, are there any questions about the Family First Coronavirus Response Act and the leaves under those acts or under the act? Okay, that's good news. And
Hey, Melissa, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, quick question. So you said it's still optional for 2021. Is there a sunset date for that right now?
Yes, it's the end of March.
End of March.
So
Okay,
we'll see
thank
what,
you.
Sure, we'll see what happens then. Hopefully everyone will have the vaccine and no one will have to miss work ever again.
And Melissa, you mentioned that the paid leave or giving it to the employee paid is their choice, not necessarily the employer's choice. Can you just elaborate a little? I hadn't heard that
Sure.
part of it.
Sure.
So I'm interested to know.
Well, you did say it perfectly, that it's their choice. And the way that I went about making sure that was documented to some degree was by creating a form that functioned as a request form. And then it also functioned as a reminder to gather all that documentation that's required by the IRS that you should keep on file for 4 years. So when you ask that question, I think back to, it was probably about March. I talked to a small business owner who said, you know what? We are getting hit by this thing already. Business is bad. I don't want employees coming in here. Everybody has a family. I think I'm just going to put them on that paid leave. And I said, whoa, I don't think that's a good idea. And really, I think that's what that requirement is trying to prevent, is an employer feeling like, oh, this is a great way to make sure that my employees still get paid and that I can scale back during, some hits to our business. And that's really not what it was intended to do. It was really intended to help people through a hard time when they had no other reason, under very specific reasons, for paid time off. So I don't know, who knows if that will ever even come up. What I think will be the biggest risk to employers is that at some point you have an IRS audit in the next 4 years and they ask you for documentation. And if you've got, a group of 30 employees all on paid FMLA for the 10 weeks that was allowed all at the same time, that's not going to look good. So that's where I think the biggest liability is, or, the other thing is that someone could go to the Department of Labor and complain about something not being done correctly, and that could result in an audit by them. So I think it's important to somehow have some mechanism in place that shows that you allowed the employee to request it versus you told the employee they were taking it, or having the appearance that it went that way.
Okay, and is this solely for the 10 weeks of sick leave or paid leave, or is it the 80 hours as well?
It's for both. So the 80 hours is the paid sick, and then the 10 weeks is that expanded FMLA. And the only reason that could be paid to an employee is if there's proof that their child's school was closed or they had no access to childcare related to COVID-19.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so let's talk about some of our safety requirements that we have here in Nevada that comes into play when you've got a workplace and employees coming to work every day. So our state requirements are all put in place through governor directives. And then we do have county requirements as well. So there's two things the county has required and Washoe County has required, is face coverings and having a written program in place. And we're going to talk about that next. And then as far as the governor directives go, most of those are enforced by OSHA. So I just wanted to share a little bit of information about getting support from OSHA and also really being familiar with what your requirements are, especially because we have seen changes on this over the course of time. So as new directives come out from the governor, it's important to stay up on that and fully understand what that requirement is. So you can do that through the Division of Industrial Relations, that's Nevada OSHA. And what they recommend that you do is look at the guidance that's posted there after every governor directive comes out. And they also are really encouraging people to use the safety consultation and training section that is provided by Nevada OSHA. What they do is provide free consultation and assistance to implement any of these mandated workplace health and safety measures. And the acronym for that arm of OSHA is SCATS. It is separate and apart and no way interfaces with the enforcement side of OSHA. So I've known HR folks to rely very heavily on SCATS to make sure that their safety programs are compliant, that they're doing everything that they need to do from a safety perspective. So it really is an incredible resource for, especially for small businesses, because it's completely free. They won't ding you for anything that you don't have in place. They are just going to encourage you to put things in place, teach you what those things are, and also they offer a wide variety of training. So it's an awesome resource to take advantage of, and especially now when we've got all of these mandates and that seem to change pretty frequently enough to make it really confusing. So I just wanted to talk about some of the things OSHA's citing. So recent examples, the beginning of December, there was a large box store that was cited here in Washoe County, and the violation was that the COVID-19 adjusted capacity was not posted at the public entrance, and the penalty fee for this was $6,268. So these fees are no joke, and it's really important to be educated and make sure that you understand what the requirements are. There was another smaller business in Washoe County that actually it may have been a different county, but that had a citation from Nevada OSHA back in November. And that was, the violation was, by the way, all of this is on the OSHA website, the Nevada OSHA website. So if you get cited, it's going to be listed. So that's another good reason to make sure that you're complying with all these requirements. But anyway, the small business had one employee not wearing a face mask. That's what the violation summary stated on the website. Just one person, and that penalty was what you're seeing on the slide here, $5,162. So this is expensive, and it's intended to make sure that these safety measures are in place, of course, and to make it hurt when they're not, because otherwise COVID spreads and we all know that can impact our economy. And so these things have to be taken very seriously. So be familiar with them, utilize OSHA's SCATS program, and then be sure that you're staying informed on what the governor directives are so that you don't have fines to the tune of thousands of dollars. You'll see on here, I've listed some resources. I will be providing you a list of resources, so you don't have to try and write all of this down, and you'll also get a copy of these slides, but you'll have a separate handout, if you will. Of course, it'll be electronic in a PDF format that will have live links to all these resources that I have listed here. So you'll definitely be able to look at that once we're done with everything. So any questions so far? All right, I will move on and talk about our safety requirements from Washoe County. So Washoe County has a small little page, I mean, amongst many pages on their website, and you see the link at the bottom of the slide here, talking about a mandatory COVID-19 business response plan. And I think this is a little known requirement, and I definitely wanted to emphasize that everyone should have a written business response plan in place if you're doing business in Washoe County. So to give you some information about what's required, you have you need to include in writing in this program or in this plan what you're doing about social distancing, what your sanitation measures are, how you're following those governor directives. So it is a plan that has to be updated when there's new directives to be followed. You have to show in writing in the plan that you're going to be trained on the plan or do training on the plan, that all your workforce will be familiar with the plan, know what all the requirements are in it, and that needs to be mapped out very clearly in this written plan. It also has to be displayed prominently. So that means it needs to be in a place where all employees can look at it and have access to it. It should probably be distributed to people individually. I always recommend an acknowledgement, go with it when you do that so that you do have proof to show that everyone received a copy of it and understand the contents and are going to follow all the requirements. And it also needs to be displayed prominently to any public that enters your workplace
Melissa,
or your place of business.
is there a template to this plan?
There is not, but HRinDemand does provide a written plan, and it will be customized to you. So we'll provide also a link to that if you're interested in it, and that is available by providing some information on our website, and then we'll turn over a customized plan to you if you're interested in that, if you haven't already done it. Another important piece of this to understand is that this has to be made available upon request by any state or regional agency that license or permits for that business type. So what that means is that there's a lot of agencies that could ask you for a copy of this. So our recommendation is that you make sure that you have this in writing, that you're doing training on it, that your employees are well aware of it. They know where it is. They know that they've seen it. They've been required to be familiar with it. So be ready for that, because I do think, any sort of agency could ask if that's in place and to be able to and look at it. Right now, Washoe County isn't requiring that it be turned in or be provided to the county for any reason, but they do say it is to be made available upon request. All right. Any other questions on that before we move on to talking about the new world of work where so many people are working at home? All right, we'll start talking about that. Well, work from home. Who knew so many people would start working from home so quickly? It's been interesting to me to observe that unfolding, because so many workplaces have been resistant to it. I think in some ways it's a fear of loss of control, and will my employees really work if they're not in their seats at work being watched? And so our mentality then when we're facing this is that we just have to monitor people and get rid of the concept of needing to control them. So I was just talking to a client of mine that has a manager that he described this manager as someone who is like, if they are not sitting at their desk, they are not working. And he just really would get upset and uptight with people working from home. So of course, 2020 probably was a very difficult year for that manager. But that's my recommendation to everybody, is that you get out of the mindset of controlling what employees are doing and go into the mindset of monitoring it. So a great rule of thumb for monitoring is to make sure deadlines are met. So as manager, maybe you switch from what did you do today to it's Friday, X, Y, and Z were due, where are you at? And just making sure that tasks are completed versus are you sitting at your desk? And I'm assuming tasks are completed. Putting some things in place that help you monitor that and ensure that those things that need to get done are getting done. Another is check-ins. So in HR, we've long preached about manager and employee check-ins. And now it's an even more compelling thing to do if you've got employees who are working from home, because it's very easy to get disconnected from each other if you're not scheduling and maintaining a schedule of regular check-ins with people. So some ideas for that is, having virtual team meetings, but also bi-weekly or at least monthly one-to-one virtual meetings. Phone calls can be a great way to do a direct check-in, and using tools to instant message is another good way to stay in contact with your team. And of course, good old email. So making sure that you're using all the tools that you can to remember that those check-ins need to happen. And then as a manager, really sticking to it, because it's, if you're a working manager, which many people are, it's very difficult to sometimes maintain that kind of a schedule. If something crazy pops up in your day, it's very easy to say, okay, well, tomorrow we'll do the check-in. But once you get off schedule, it can be hard to maintain it. So that's an important aspect of making sure that work from home is successful, and you're not having disengaged employees who are feeling not connected to the work or to their manager or to their team. Those check-ins are really vital and helpful. So some software, of course, we're all familiar with Zoom. Here we are, the year of Zoom 2020, right? I remember I used to hate video conferences and video phone calls, and now it just seems like normal part of everyday life. Some other things to think about is if you've got employees using their own cell phones, it's a good idea to look at what technology there is to add apps that can offer separating out the business use of a personal cell phone from the personal use. So one that comes to mind is Grasshopper. They provide a way to have a business line connected to a personal cell phone. And it gives a lot of features on that, business features on the personal cell phone. So it's a good way to keep things separate if you're asking an employee to use a personal cell phone. Another tool that's great to use is instant messaging tools. So Slack is a good example. Most email systems have instant messaging tools that you can utilize. All the time I hear bigger organizations say IM is so nice because you can get an immediate response, and they start categorizing the things that they need by the tools that they use. So if you need an immediate response, you use an instant message. If you need to have a conversation and it's something that you need some back and forth on, you have a phone call. If you just need to check in, ensure things are being done, or have a quick question or two or three, you can use email. So it's interesting to see that people have pivoted to that. And so instant messaging is really helpful. It kind of helps the quick things get addressed quickly and not hold somebody up from being able to do their regular tasks. And then, of course, we have to talk about security software. WebRoot is something that is recommended to me as a business owner. It's easy to install, it's easy to maintain, but making sure that your employees, if they're using personal equipment, that cybersecurity is in place. And then file sharing is another really great tool to use when you're all working distantly. So things like Dropbox, SharePoint, Box, OneDrive, Google Suite, all of those are really great tools to use to keep everything in one place and allow people who aren't in one place to have access to everything that they need to have access to. So another thing that is really important to keep in mind when you're working from home, because it's tough. It's easy to stay in your pajamas, and I might admit that, I'm probably not going to want to have that Zoom call if I haven't bothered to put my clothes on for the day and I'm just staying in my pajamas. So support and encouraging your team to have schedules and stay on a schedule is really important, and encouraging them to set up their home office in a way that's functional for them, have a dedicated workspace. I teach classes at UNR, and I did a Zoom class through a Zoom meeting, and there was someone that attended that class that was sitting in her bed the entire time. So I felt bad for her because she may be in a situation where that's all she's got. So if possible, and you see that with your team, it's not a bad idea to say, hey, have you thought about a desk? Maybe we can run that through company expenses, and just get yourself a dedicated workspace. So support your employees and support your staff and encourage them to do what they need to do to be as productive as possible, but also comfortable. It's a great idea to set schedules, having people clock in and out so that they're keeping track of it. Still require breaks. Nevada still, even if you work from home, you have to, as an employer, provide breaks to your employees. So make sure employees understand that it's still a requirement. And even if it means going into the kitchen and making your sandwich, that's going to be your lunch break, or whatever the case may be, that people are taking that time away from work. And then a definition around quitting time is also a really good idea. What time are we going to end? Because I can see my boss is still on instant messenger, so I better stick around. Or, oh my gosh, I can't believe it's already 7:30 p.m. when I started at 7 a.m. I just got so caught up in what I was doing that I didn't realize what time it was, because I'm at home and it's easy and I'm not having any cues from people around me getting up and leaving, and I'm just discombobulated schedule wise. So helping your team figure out a schedule and put it in place is incredibly important. And then, of course, I think all of us probably can relate to really feeling it when you have no socialization with your team. So I applaud all those managers who put things in place like pizza parties, happy hours. Maybe you play a game through Zoom. You have your team bring their family members if they want to a meeting. I know with my small little team, one day my daughters were on a virtual call with my team member's son, who just turned a year old. So they got to see each other and talk to each other, and we got to acknowledge that we're at home and we're with our children, and that's okay, and the reality, and have a little fun with it. And then pizza parties, care packages, things like that. As a leader of a team, you can send care packages and then have everybody open them at the same time, and that can be a fun way for you all to come together without having it be all work related, but also just have a little bit of fun and connection with each other again, because that can easily go to the wayside. And so we've got to do things to make sure that it doesn't, because when that happens, people start feeling isolated. It's hard to be excited about work sometimes. And so as leaders, we've got to make sure that we're keeping the entertainment alive, so to speak. So some quick tips for managers when it comes to etiquette, really, with your team, because they watch everything that you do. And so what are some things that you can put in place to make sure that you're being respectful of them? Because when we're in this world of isolation, it's hard to keep those things in mind or really fully understand how something might land. If we're not around each other, we can't gauge body language, we can't gauge reactions. And so it's just a good idea to keep these etiquette points in mind as a leader of a team. So don't chat and text after hours, because even if your intent is, hey, I'm just going to send this to you right now because I'll forget if I don't do it right now. If I'm an employee and I get a text, I think I have to respond to that. And if it's 7:30 at night and they've already worked a full long day, that's just really not fair. So be real aware of that, especially as we start to rely on these tools more and more to communicate. Also, don't expect immediate responses to email, and don't assume if there's not an immediate response that someone's off doing their laundry or going to the grocery store or taking a nap. It doesn't mean that. We won't know. And that goes back to, if you can just manage productivity versus where you think people are or what they're doing with their time, you're going to be much more effective management wise. if you send an email and you don't get an immediate response, don't let that evoke an emotional reaction out of you. Like think back to the manager I gave you the example of. They must not be in their seat. This is driving me crazy. I can't stand it. Now I'm going to come down on them and I'm going to make sure that they know that they have to be at their computer all day long. That's just hard because we're all dealing with this new world together. And so empathy and a little grace around a non-immediate response is certainly warranted. And who knows, maybe they're on the phone. Maybe they're working on a project and they've minimized their emails so they don't get interrupted and they can be more effective. So keep that in mind. Communicate your schedule. So make sure that your employees know, hey, you know what? Tomorrow I'm going to start at 10 because I have something I have to do in the morning. So that means I'm going to still be, sending emails at 7 or 8, but that doesn't mean that I expect you to do the same thing. So talking about that and setting that expectation is important. Minimize your interruptions, especially when you're having those one-to-one meetings. Making sure that you're providing full attention to your team is really important, because if you don't do it, they're going to take a cue from you that they don't have to do it. And then I think we all know interruptions are going to happen, but if we are interrupted a lot, it's saying that it's okay, and that's really makes it difficult to maintain the productivity at home. So another thing to think about, if you have to send an email and it's three paragraphs long, it's probably not a bad idea to pick up the phone and just make that a phone call, because long emails can be really daunting for people. And then how are you writing those emails? What's the tone? Are you being real direct because you don't have a lot of time? Take a second, and I'm guilty of this. I have to do this frequently. Years ago, I got some feedback on it actually, but I have to stop and say, okay, I should probably say hello to this person. I should probably ask them how they're doing. I should probably say something that's friendly in the beginning of my email and at the end of my email. So using friendly words is really helpful when you're relying so much on electronic communication. And then when you're in meetings like we're in today, if you've got your team in a meeting and someone's doing a presentation, you should be muting your speaker, because oftentimes sounds in the background, even shuffling of paper can pop up on that microphone and interrupt the person who's doing all the talking. So just be mindful of those things, that if you're not muted, you could be causing some distraction. And if you're the leader, probably no one's going to tell you, hey boss, mute your Zoom. I can imagine that not very many employees want to be telling their boss that. So just be aware of those sorts of things. I can see that there's some chats, and I just want to make sure that people are getting questions answered if they have them. And again, I don't know why I'm having a problem with it, but
Melissa, one of the questions are, what are the workers' comp implications of workers working from home?
What is that? I'm sorry, what was that? Workers' comp cases from working from home? I don't know stats on that. I do know that the clients that I have that have people working from home, that hasn't come up. And that's part of the reason it's a good idea to communicate what expectations are. Back to identifying a dedicated workspace. I read something just recently that someone was working in their basement and had a gas leak and didn't realize it. And was this a workers' comp claim? So then the employer kind of has to go through that whole process. So making sure that your employees are taking the time to put themselves at the best, most safe place during their workday is important. So really, Dave, I think it probably depends on the situation and what's at play. And that's where, as employers, we really want to rely heavily on our workers' comp carrier to guide us through that and, help us identify, okay, this is a claim, it's not a claim, or yes, you need to submit it as a claim because everyone has a right to workers' comp, and then the carrier can decide whether or not it qualifies as workers' comp. And, I think it's important for people to know that they have an expectation of safety at home, just like they would in the workplace. But it's also important to know that they have some responsibility in that and making sure that they know they need to make their work areas safe. So hopefully that answered the question. I'm sorry, I don't know stats for sure. Any other questions out there?
Melissa, this is Peter. Is there a difference with this information you've given if you were paying someone hourly versus a salary?
Well, that depends. In
Or
the
do you
state of
change
Nevada, what's
Or do you
that?
change it, or do you change everybody to salary versus hourly?
No, you can't do that because you would run the risk of misclassifying them. And when that happens, there's different state and federal agencies that have requirements on classifications. And if you're misclassifying them, they could look at it like you're trying to dodge paying people overtime, which can be really a tricky issue when you have people working from home. So if someone is properly categorized as entitled to overtime, I highly recommend you have set schedules and some mechanism in place that helps you track work hours. And this goes to those text messages and instant messages that you send outside of that employee's dedicated work time, because that could result in overtime, and you need to just be careful that that isn't putting the employer in the place of not paying overtime. And an employee can be okay with that for a little while, but usually something that's okay at one day ends up not being okay later. No good deed goes unpunished, and that employee can say, you know what, thinking back on this, I've been working 60-hour weeks for weeks and being paid for 40, and I have every right to overtime. So in Nevada, there's a rule on the book, or a law on the books, that says every employer must pay or must keep track of work hours for every single employee, regardless of that classification of salary or paid hourly, exempt for overtime or not exempt from overtime. And the reason that is because if someone was misclassified as salary, like Peter suggested, it would probably just be easier to make everyone's salary. So if they're misclassified that way, and then they say, you know what, I want my overtime pay, I figured this out, I'm entitled to it, I'm going to go to the department or the labor commissioner. Then the labor commissioner goes to the employer and says, okay, we have this allegation, please produce your records. We have a law that says you're supposed to be keeping records on every single employee. So if you've been paying this person's salary and you have no records of when they worked, then what will happen is the labor commissioner will say, okay, that's not good. And we're going to take a look at the employee's records, and we have to go off of that. So frequently the employee records might be a little more in favor of the employee getting paid large amounts of overtime. So if the employer doesn't have a way to dispute that, they're looking at having to make up that pay, and it can be very, very costly. So even if someone's paid on a salary basis, I recommend keeping records of hours worked. So that was a good question. Anyone else want to bring up any work from home questions or problems you've encountered out there? All right. I am keeping an eye on time, and I think it's looking like we probably will have a little bit of time for question and answers at the end. I want to just touch on fraudulent unemployment claims, because this is a huge problem in Nevada, and we're seeing it be repetitive. So someone might have a fraudulent claim filed against them, and then it happens again. And so as employers, we have to be sure that we respond to it, and that we make sure that DETR, the state agency who oversees all the unemployment claims, knows that this is a fraudulent claim. So we do get notifications in the mail that a claim has come in. If you know if it's fraudulent, your employee has never missed any work, you need to write fraudulent on the claim. My best practice advice to everyone is to talk to the employee and make sure first that they didn't submit the claim. And 9 out of 10 times they're going to say, no, I submitted no unemployment claim. What's happening? Well, now really they're dealing with a case of stolen identity, because these forms that are submitted and the request for unemployment that's submitted to DETR has a lot of personal information. So for an example, social security number is part of all of this. So now whoever's submitting this fraudulent claim has that employee's personal information. So you need to make sure that the employee is notified and give them some information about what they need to do. So this is a big issue. The FBI is involved in it. Obviously, our state attorney general is involved in it, and they're trying to keep people updated about what they need to do. So this resource that I have is a good one to share with your own employees because it tells them what they need to do. And there's also there's a page on the DETR website where you can submit a fraudulent claim to them. I don't know how well that's working. We all know at this point that DETR is extremely taxed in terms of their resources and their ability to handle a lot of stuff. So regardless of all of that, as an employer, to make sure that you've somehow communicated and provided to them a document that shows that this is a fraudulent claim is really important. Notifying your employee, telling them to treat this as identity theft and to do all the things that they need to do, which includes notifying the IRS, notifying the FBI of electronic stolen identity, notifying all those credit agencies that need to know that your identity has been stolen. All those steps that happen with identity theft need to happen in this case. So as employers, I don't think there's any requirements to make sure employees are educated on this, but I sure think it's the right thing to do. So any questions on that? I just want to, yes.
Do you know any information about how this is happening, how they're getting the information?
No.
No trends available yet?
Yeah, it's very,
it's just so widespread.
Yeah, and it's happening all through the country. So it's not just Nevada, but we have certainly been hit hard here.
Yeah.
And DETR is very mum on how this happened and why it happened. But there has to be a breach of something somewhere for it to be as widespread as it is. But I don't know what that is.
Okay.
So like I said, the FBI on that link that was on the last slide recommends reporting fraud to law enforcement, state unemployment, the IRS, credit bureaus, and the Internet Crime Complaint Center. So again, all these links will be provided to you in the handout that follows after the presentation. And then identitytheft.gov helps in reporting and recovering from identity theft. So it's just great resources to provide to your employees if they're in the situation of having to deal with all of that. So a couple things I think are just interesting to talk about from. Yes.
Melissa, I think we have one more question from Clemencia.
Well, I was
Okay.
just going to say, Melissa, that we encountered that like right in the middle of the COVID thing. And I actually got a debit for my husband, who is the employee of our corporation. And, he's the only employee. And like, why would we be getting a debit card? Why would we be getting all this information from DETR? But I couldn't get a hold of anybody during that time. And so I went online and I filed it as a fraudulent claim. But when I filed it, it never came back with a confirmation that I had actually done it. So I kept the card and I kept all the paperwork for probably a couple of months. I kept trying to get through. I finally got through to somebody and, finally everything is like, yeah, they know it was fraudulent. But boy, that was just really a challenge to get through. I couldn't, but actually I had no idea. I probably should really be reporting more of it. So
yeah, and I would say go ahead and do it. It's not too late.
Okay.
It doesn't matter that it happened months ago. Go ahead and report to the IRS, to those credit bureaus, law enforcement, and the Internet Crime Complaint Center. Because that will also give record that you reported that your information was compromised.
Right. Nothing else has occurred, but it was just really, it was like there was lack of confirmation on DETR's part,
Yeah,
like,
and you're not the only person that's experienced that. Someone said to me that this was a group of HR people were talking, and someone said, what we're doing is doing print screen when we're submitting that what you talked about, you're submitting that it's a fraudulent claim, and then keeping the print screen of it somewhere so that you have proof that you reported it. Because what could end up happening, and especially for those businesses that are not in the tax pool, if you're paying claims directly, which some nonprofits are allowed to do that, if you end up getting these claims hit to you because there was you have no way to prove that you reported it as fraudulent, that could end up being a cost that you as the employer have to take up. And if you have a bunch of claims and they're not treated as fraudulent, that can, when the review of your claims experience happens for your tax, your tax level, it could increase the amount of tax that you as an employer pay to unemployment.
Right.
So lots of reasons to report it for sure.
Right.
Okay, any other questions on that before we move on? All right. So some strange old new HR policies. Wow, COVID just had some fun with what the world of HR is. I never thought that we would see a time where the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission told employers it was okay to take employees' temperatures. This is something that, had you asked me in 2019 that would be allowed, I would have just laughed. That's just ridiculous, because there are so many ways in which employers are curbed from having any information about employees and what could ultimately be health information, that needs to be protected under HIPAA, but that also can contribute to the perception of some sort of disability, and therefore gives employees some protection. And it's really easy for the employer to go wrong with all of that information. So now we're being told it's okay to take temperatures. And then the question becomes, what do you do when you take those temperatures with the information that you're gathering? And my strong advice to anyone that's doing this or keeping logs on this, or having employees fill out questionnaires, because I know that was something that was done in the beginning in many workplaces, that you are treating that as personal health information that is protected under HIPAA, that is accessible to only those who need to know that information. And so in HR, that means we've got to make sure it's stored under lock and key, that, no one's seeing it, it's not laying around. If you're doing a temperature log, it can't just be sitting out with employee's name and what their temperature was. You have to treat this information very carefully. So if you've got any questions about that, let me know. I am going to jump into quarantine after exposure and when do people return to work. So quarantining's an interesting thing, and we've seen some developments in as far as the CDC recommendations on what we should be doing for quarantine. One of the things is they were saying that for a while you had to be out of work if you're diagnosed as positive COVID for 14 days. But they've recently told us, it's just been a couple months, I think, since they changed this. A negative test can happen if someone is tested early. So if someone has symptoms, we shouldn't just rely on testing alone to tell us whether or not someone shouldn't come to work or should or can come to work, because you could have someone with symptoms and a negative test. And as employers, we don't want someone with symptoms coming into the workplace. So the CDC has tried to clarify this conundrum and is recommending that 7 days after exposure, if there's no symptoms and you go 24 hours without any temperature, that it's okay to return to work. So the point I want to make here is that when you're deciding about whether or not someone can come back to work, it's okay to look at tests and to look at symptoms and to make decisions based on both of those things, but not just one or the other necessarily. Well, I would really say not relying so much on testing, but more on symptom-based return to work. CDC is continuing to recommend quarantine after exposure, and that's a little bit longer. So if you test negative for COVID-19 or feel healthy, you should still stay home to quarantine after exposure, because symptoms can appear anywhere from 2 to 14 days. after exposure. So, I think for a little while, people were thinking, oh, after 10 days, you're okay. But really their recommendation is 14, just because symptoms can start then. And early on, you could have COVID and test negative for it. So relying simply on tests is not recommended. And then how do you handle exposure if you've got that in the workplace? That's a big deal. And being careful about how you're handling that is important, because this again is personal health information. So you have some obligations under HIPAA to protect that information. So if you know an employee has COVID, you can say to them, is it okay if I tell Jane, who sits next to you in the cubicle and you guys talk a lot, that you have COVID, so that she knows that she should probably go get tested? And the employee says, I'll tell her. That's probably the best case scenario. But ultimately the news spreads, but it's just important that it's not documented that it was spread by the employer. So for an example, I would recommend, again, sending out an email to everyone saying, oh, Susie Q has COVID. If you want to get tested, let me know. And we hope she gets better soon. Now you violated HIPAA, not a good thing to do. But it is okay to say, we do have a positive case of COVID at work. The person was here for 2 days before they realized they had COVID, or whatever the situation is, and you will be contacted directly if you were directly exposed to this person. So then exposure tracing is really important, and making sure you're communicating to employees that we're going to make sure if you've been exposed, because there's nothing worse than an email going out saying, oh yeah, we do have a case at work, and then nothing else, because how do I know that case isn't somebody that I interact with regularly? So being careful and having some sort of procedure or guideline, so that you and any manager in the organization knows to handle this situation consistently and the same each and every time is important. Training managers is important, and just having real consistency in the process is important, because it would be a shame to treat one person differently with exposure than another person based on something that may not have been a decision factor. So for an example, if somebody's is Asian and they're made to stay home, this kind of thing happened more in the beginning. I don't think it's happening like it did now, but is made to stay home because they've been exposed. And then a coworker who's not Asian was exposed and got to come back to work in 2 days. So those sorts of things can be a real problem for employers that have 15 or more employees, and equal employment opportunity laws are at play. And so being consistent about how you do things is very, very important. And then now I think our probably most strange situation is this concept of whether or not we should mandate the COVID vaccine in the workplace. Generally, employers can mandate vaccines, but best practice recommendations, and I think maybe even some legal considerations, are that it has to be done after the FDA has approved it, because right now the COVID vaccine has an emergency use authorization status. It has not been approved. So because of that, employers may run into some problems trying to mandate it until that's in place. So stay informed on that if you feel like you need to mandate it. I have the opportunity to work with several hospitals throughout Nevada, and no one is taking the path of mandating the vaccine. And part of it is because of the emergency use authorization, but also a part of it is just because it would be a very tricky thing to mandate it. And really, my personal belief is it could easily impact morale. I don't think employees like personal choices like getting the vaccine to be mandated by their employer. So the hit that you can take from morale on mandating it is large. And then making sure that you have their authorization is also something, going back to consistency and having records and all that sort of thing is extremely important. And if you're not organized around that, that can come back to bite if you're mandating it. And then lastly is if the person has a reaction to it. Is this now the responsibility of the employer because you mandated it? So there's just a lot of things to think about. And then added on top of that, if it is mandated, but an employee comes to you and says, I need an accommodation not to have the vaccine based on my religious beliefs, or I have a disability, or I know I could have some sort of reaction to the vaccine. There's some compelling health reason I can't take it. And the employer doesn't handle that as an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act and enter into the interactive process with that employee and document all of that and take every step that they're supposed to take in request for accommodation and how that's approved or not approved, that could cause some real liability exposure to the employer. So I personally think mandating is not the way I would go in my business, but ultimately it's an individual decision that employers are going to be faced with. And I would really recommend getting some legal advice on it. It's hard though, because there's not a lot of case law on this, because we've never really been at a place as employers to mandate vaccines. So it's hard to know how courts will rule if there's a problem related to it. This next slide, I just want to show everyone the roadmap to recovery for Nevada is an excellent tool for people to use. The roadmap to recovery for Nevada is a really nice tool. So here you can see the general office environment recommendations, but for different industries, Nevada Health Response has provided these sorts of recommended sheets. So what's best practice versus what's mandatory when you're talking about employees and visitors, when you're talking about physical spaces, when you're talking about dealing with confirmed cases. And so it's really nice that we see this mapped out this way. And like I said, we're looking at the page that's general office environments, but there's also a page for manufacturing and for restaurants and for all sorts of different industries. So it is very helpful to the employer because it really tells you what those governor directives are and what becomes mandatory as a workplace because of those directives in Nevada. So great tool to use. Highly recommend that you check that out. And you'll have a link provided to you to get there in the resource listing that I provide. This is the list of resources that I'll be providing. And then, like I said, I'm going to share a handout with all of you, and the handout will look like this. It'll be a PDF and it'll have live links to all those websites. So you'll be able to get there real quickly. So be on the lookout for that. It'll also be on the NCET website, right, Dave? So any questions?
Melissa, going back to the COVID, when you started talking about, you said 7 days after exposure, it was 24 hours after exposure, it's okay to come back to work. What was that?
No, I'm glad you asked that question.
I'm sorry, it went by fast. I might have not caught it all there.
Yeah, and I will also share 2 documents that were put out by I think it was either the state of Nevada or the county. It might have been the state health department or health agency. Anyway, I'll share those with you because what they did is summarize the current CDC recommendations on this, and this has changed. So it's even a little confusing for me. So let me go back and re-say what I was explaining. So if someone has COVID or has symptoms of COVID, then they can return to work after 10 days if they are symptom free, or 10 days if there's a 24-hour period with no fever reducing medications and no fever present.
Okay.
And so that's why the recommendation is to use a combination of testing and symptom-based return to work. Because you could have a negative test, but if someone's got symptoms, you don't want them there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. And it's good to see you, Clemencia. It's been a long time.
I know. Thanks. Thank you for the info.
You're welcome. All right. Well, I will include my email address, and I'm always happy to answer questions. And so feel free to reach out to me if you have any.
Well, Melissa, that was great. The tremendous amount of information. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's always great to be at NCET.
Oh,
I haven't done this in a while, so it's cool. You
We
guys are
missed
doing a
you.
great job of helping us feel connected. That's for sure.
well, thanks, everybody. And Melissa, thank you again. That was wonderful. And thank you for coming back.
Yes, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks, Dave.